Morning, everybody. That's nice, yeah. Good morning. Of course, the big story today in the UK is that it's Her Majesty's birthday, and I was very tempted to get you to be upstanding for the national anthem, but I thought Jon Snow of all people would find that somewhat awkward. Listen, a very warm welcome to the LSE, and this is the 7th Polis Annual Journalism Conference. My name's Charlie Beckett. I used to work at places like the BBC and Channel 4 News. I've been here at the LSE since 2006. I'm a professor in the Department of Media and Communications, and I'm the director of Polis, which is the LSE's journalism think tank, which runs this conference. And our theme today is reporting crisis, and it does sometimes feel like we are living in a world of permanent crisis, especially if you consume a lot of news media. This year, the UK news media agenda, for example, has been dominated by a mass forced migration sweeping across borders. We've seen the effects of a terror movement spawned out of apparently irresolvable conflicts in distant lands, smashing its way into the heart of European cities. And of course, Europe itself is a continent that seems to be, at times, breaking apart politically. And now the public tell us that they often feel overwhelmed by this daily media diet of disruption and danger. And journalists tell me also that they often feel exhausted by the relentless agenda of agony and angst. And of course, at the same time, traditional news is being swamped by a tidal wave of images and information surging through social networks. And this is all happening at a time when newsrooms have never been more under pressure, and they and their audience must deal with a kind of digital whirlwind of often conspiracy, confusion, and complexity around any crisis event or issue. And this can leave the public, the people that journalism is supposed to serve, it can leave them depressed and even distant from journalism itself. It may also leave them feeling that they're in a world of crisis where there's no one they can trust. And so it's no wonder that people feel an alienation from authority, including the authority of journalists. Yet the appetite for information and debate has, I think, never been greater. The evidence is that people really do care, and we can see that from their endless desire for communication. And some of that communication shows us that people are angry, they're critical, and they are confused. But the evidence is also there that people want media to improve their lives. They want it to help perhaps build communities and create understanding. But how we understand the world is changing, and how journalism seeks to report and explain it must change too. This is partly about how journalism adapts to new technology, to new tools and new platforms, and those offer remarkable new ways to bear witness, to explain, and to engage. But it's also a question of attitude. Journalists must put the public first, not just as consumers, but as citizens, and most of all, I think, as human beings. We shouldn't be afraid that emotions are driving this interest in news, especially on social networks. We should be transparent about our own subjectivity. We should embrace the idea of making news relevant to people as people. And of course, we should at the same time always strive for facts, for data, for context and revelations, and try to present a fair and diverse range of views. But the human interest should always be at the core of our work, be it a long-form documentary or a Snapchat update. Journalism is perhaps never more important than when things in the world go catastrophically wrong. Crisis reporting can be literally a matter of life and death, and so let's try, against the odds, to make it better. Now, today we've got an amazing range of speakers who are going to explain how they report crisis. We're going to debate the big editorial issues, but we also have lots of practical sessions on innovation. I'm pleased to say we're also going to showcase my department's major new research project looking at media and refugees. And we're also going to be showing a Polis film about how journalists in Lebanon have reported on and continue to report on the refugee crisis there. So please tweet with the hashtag Polis2016, ask questions and enjoy your day, and keep in touch with us afterwards. But before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just want to thank all the speakers who are giving up their valuable time today. I also want to thank my colleague, Julia Zima, who manages Polis and who runs this conference, and all the volunteers who keep it free and thriving. And I'd also like to say a little grazie to Matilda for her support and inspiration for me personally. Now, let's get on with the show. I am very proud to start with Jon Snow from Channel 4 News. I was very lucky to work with Jon on stories like the London bombings at ITN. And at moments of crisis, there's no better reporter in the field or the studio. There's no better writer at conveying the humanity as well as the significance of a story. And even though he dates from a pre-digital era, Jon Snow has an essential connectivity. It's a connectivity that grips audiences of all ages and backgrounds. So please welcome Jon Snow.
Thank you, Charlie, very much. Well, I'm asked to address Alienation and Crisis, Can Journalists Win Back Public Confidence? I think we probably know the answer to that, but at any rate, we'll have a shot. I believe that we're living in an age of unprecedented collision between public alienation and political disintegration. I think that this characterizes the particular moment in which we're living, and in all honesty, I'm not an Armageddonistic character, but I genuinely felt at the beginning of this year that this was the most Armageddonistic moment that I had lived through as a reporter, and that includes any time in the Cold War. And plus, now one can look back indeed to the Cold War as a period of remarkable order. We kind of knew who the enemy was, we knew what our job was, we knew what we stood for, we knew what they stood for, and the world was very neatly divided, and we never thought it would change. We thought the Berlin Wall would be there forever. It was an appalling shock when it came down, and of course a liberating shock and a wonderful shock, but it's something from which I'm not entirely sure that we've yet recovered from. And the fact that there is no kind of bulwark of order against which we can measure disorder or indeed even tackle disorder is one of the reasons I think we may be where we are. But I think obviously, as Charlie referred to, the truth of the matter is that in some ways the alienation and the political disintegration are stoked massively by our activity on the social network, our capacity to criticize, our capacity to spread intriguing articles and the rest of it. I mean, I think people possibly read more long-form journalism than they've ever read. Organs like the New York Review of Books, the LRB, Atlantic Monthly, to talk about high-end publications, are far more widely read today than they were ever in the pre-digital age. And so consequently, the battle for ideas continues, but nothing emerges from it that in any way feeds into what is our conventional political system. And I want to look first of all at alienation globally, and then try and track back from there. I mean, I think unquestionably, I would just for needing to start somewhere, I would start with the referendum in Scotland last year. I had the privilege of being in Scotland in what I have described as one of the most intoxicating, and I don't mean that from the Scotch whisky point of view, but one of the most intoxicating political experiences I've ever had, in which everybody you ever spoke to could speak politics, could speak about what they wanted, what they cared about, and what they hated. And what was so amazing was to be in the East End of Glasgow, one of the most solidly Labour places where people with large bottoms had sat in Parliament doing very little for a very long time, were suddenly rendered completely obliterated. And people were talking about a completely new new thing, but they weren't, interestingly, talking to me about independence. They didn't really come bounding up to me and say, I'd love an independent Scotland, I want to be floating free out in the North Sea, I want to be in a kilt, I want to have a big safety pin and a sporran. Nobody ever talked to me about any of that. What people talked about was total alienation from Westminster, a complete lack of recognition at all that anything that happened in Westminster had anything to do with them whatsoever. It was about alienation. And then I look at UKIP, largely elderly, largely working class, deeply alienated, people who have not experienced a pay rise in 40 years. Of course, of the pensioners, that's not true, but people of late working age feeling no sense that their quality of life had really seriously improved in the period of the last 20 years. And of course, the statistics suggest it may be as long as 40 years. And yet at the same time, through courtesy of mass communication and the social network, a bitter awareness of what was happening at the other end of the equation, people becoming so unmeasurably rich that you couldn't even describe it. And yet the absolute knowledge that that richness, that largesse, that criminality, that everything else at that level had actually resulted in them losing money, in them losing public services because the money had to go to bailing out the banks. Everybody knew this incredibly well. And frankly, if you wanted to create alienation, the banking crisis was its ultimate stoker. People had every opportunity to understand that fundamentally they'd been rendered poorer by the activities of a tiny minority of people who were to go unpunished and indeed not even to suffer. They're all back. They've all got precisely what they had before it all went bust. And it's an extraordinary, the idea that a population wouldn't be affected by such a development is absurd. It's absolutely inevitable that it would result in a degree of alienation, and that was not alienation which was restricted to the United Kingdom, but of course was globally across the developed world, particularly in America, but also in Europe, and Europe has yet even to begin to really seriously recover from it. So there at Scotland I've talked about UKIP, and then you look at Labour, and of course there was a deep sense of alienation in the Labour Party, which resulted in the election of Jeremy Corbyn. Anybody but them was the vote for Jeremy Corbyn. It's ridiculous to say that people really saw in Jeremy Corbyn in some way a risen Christ. What they saw was somebody who hadn't got any dirty fingers from the previous activities of war and pestilence and everything else that had gone on during the Blair years. There was a sense in which here was at least a guy who'd been in politics for 30 years and apparently never got dirty, which was an extraordinary quality. And he got elected. Poor man, he never ever set out on a journey to become the leader of the Labour Party. He arrives, he had nobody to help him. A few good old lefties sort of turn out to sort of try and prop him up. And, John McDonnell, huge brain, slightly poor judgment, but that's okay. But really, genuinely, one of the brightest people I've ever interviewed, a really interesting man. But the little red book didn't go well. And what did that result in? Well, it resulted in actually not very much. They're all sitting there still. They're still shouting at each other in the House of Commons and the rest of it. Conservatives, I don't know. Amazing. There's no fuss at all, but we ran a story last night, and we'll be running a much bigger story tonight about how there has been they say an administrative error, but it has resulted in massive extra expenditure in local parliamentary seats in many parts of the country. Last night we described the 9 seats in the West Country, which were largely Liberal Democrat held, in which tens of thousands of pounds were spent by the central organisation locally. That's not all. You have a very fixed level of expenditure, very low level, I must say. It's a very small sum of money that you're allowed to spend in fighting a parliamentary seat in a constituency. But the import of very large numbers of people at the expense of somebody outside the constituency to fight the constituency is against the rules of the election process. And so what we've seen in the 9 seats there has been an over-expenditure by many thousands of pounds. in every single seat we investigated. Every single seat we investigated. We investigated 9, and it had happened in all of them, and all of them were held by Liberal Democrats. Imagine the situation in which you're in coalition, and you've got all these people opposite you, people of another party, but with whom you've actually governed rather responsibly, and they are sitting there thinking, how are we going to destroy this guy? I know, we'll spend a little bit more here and a bit there and a bit there, and away we go, and bang, Bob's your uncle, and we're in power without them. Thank God. We will have 36.9% of the electorate vote for us. That's not a huge amount, but it's enough to have a 17-seat majority. That'll be fine. Well, it may be because nobody else has really picked it up. I think the Daily Mail has, and we're always pleased to have the Daily Mail as an ally. Today, we revealed 20 more seats in which this has happened, not just in one part of the country, but in the north, in the Midlands, in which there has been a mysterious over-expenditure. And this is largely in taking a battle bus into a constituency, blitzing the constituency on behalf of one candidate, which is the candidate in that constituency, and therefore spending far, far more than the system would ever allow. It would mean that everybody's door got knocked, and you wonder how on earth you could finance that locally. The local parties aren't actually that active enough, really, to produce that number of people to do anything like that, but it happened. Do we care? Probably not, really, because it simply subscribes to something which actually I think many more people than Scotland feel very strongly, and that is an alienation from Westminster. We don't recognise ourselves in the House that represents us. We don't see our own kind. We don't see many women. I mean, we're very excited because there's over 100 women in a 600-seat chamber. That's actually not an exciting achievement. We see we've got a few ethnic minorities in the House of Commons, but it doesn't look like the people. When you go on the tube, you don't see the House of Commons. When you go on a train, you don't see the House of Commons. So how is it that our society, which is the most wonderful and achieving multicultural society probably in the Western world, how is it that it's not reflected in our House of Commons? And who does actually speak to other people the way they speak to each other? I mean, who does need to yell at the person? I mean, if you do have a conversation on a train, you don't find yourself sitting across the aisle and just shouting and hurling abuse at the person on the other side. But it's easy to rib the Westminster, but the fact is there has been no serious attempt to bring it into the 21st century, or even to bring it into the 20th century in our lifetime. And one wonders why not. There must be many people who go in and think, I'm going to change this. I'm going to make it more like something that I feel at ease with, where I feel I can really make a difference, and gradually get ground down by, the bars, there are lots of them, 11, you can get pissed if you feel a bit, finished off with the whole thing. Why not at least enjoy life, the rest of it? No, the fact is it desperately cries out for reform. And you take, for example, the building it's in, it's falling down. And there have got to be people who hope it will fall down. And in falling down, produce a situation in which some other physical organisation will have to be developed in order to house them. And when you begin to build a physical place for an activity to take place, I'm not sure that you will design it in such a way that people shout at each other and feel thoroughly uncomfortable about the way it's going. And I've gone on about Westminster, but Westminster really does desperately cry out for reform, and there's no evidence that anybody wants to do anything about it at all. The idea, anyway, of having 650 people in there to represent it is also absurd. We're talking about devolution. We have devolved power to Scotland. We've devolved power to Northern Ireland. We've devolved power to Wales, and yet the House of Commons hasn't got any smaller. Why? They should be doing half the work they were doing. They're not, of course, because, in fact, actually devolution's going the other way. Actually, education is being centralised, health is being centralised, because we can't trust people locally to run their own affairs. Nobody bothers to work for a local authority. Why would you work for a local authority if it has no power? You have to empower local authorities to make people feel, I could change something here. People do want to change things locally, but they don't want to change them the way they're being told to change them. They need to be able to decide for themselves whether they want to change things or not. So the centralisation of power in Britain, whilst we talk so liberally about the decentralisation of power, is something which only stokes further alienation. Now, I've obviously concentrated on Britain because it's somewhere we know best, but we could easily look at the United States. there must be people even in this room who lie awake at night and worry about Donald Trump. But I would stop worrying about Donald Trump and start worrying about Ted Cruz. I don't think Ted Cruz is actually going to win, but Ted Cruz, guns and God, this is not good for the planet. The idea, and to be absolutely honest, it's a bit like the Labour leadership contest. You've got three leading candidates, Clinton, Cruz, Trump, dear old Bernie. I don't think Bernie's going to make it, but he's a wonderful sort of, needle in the haystack, wiggling around, making life a bit awkward for various people. But the other three candidates are really deeply unimpressive, and worryingly unimpressive. Somebody said to me earlier this week when we were talking about Obama coming here, America may have to wait another 50 years before it gets a president as good as Obama. That is a frightening thought. Because dear old Obama has been a wonderful moral force, an amazing guy, but he has not actually, in the end, been able to deal with many of the problems that presidents are expected to be able to wrestle with, and largely because, just like Westminster, Congress turns out to be completely unsustainable in the form that it's in. It has completely wrecked Obama's attempts to civilize the United States. Healthcare is a modern miracle. The idea that he got it through simply defies gravity. I mean, every single possible factor was against him in ever being able to do it. The corporate sector, the congressional sector, everybody was against him, and yet he achieved it. And that was one of the reasons why he'll be regarded as a great president. And Iran was another issue which they were absolutely determined to trash, and somehow he did by sheer force of personality and determination. He was the man who, in Cairo in 2004, opened the open hand of friendship to Iran. And anybody who understands anything about the balances in the Middle East and across the world, the idea that you could exclude Iran from the world stage for decades and think that in some way you'd be building a safer world is bonkers, actually bonkers. It has been a completely crazy endeavor to exclude them. And we could have done it some other way. This is simply not the way for humanity to function. So you've got these systems, and we might as well look at Europe. I mean, I'm not allowed to declare which way I feel about Europe, but I could at least say I like working together with people generally. But on the other hand, hands up in here who can name their MEP. 6 hands. How many people in here can name their MP? Better. We're about half. But MEP, amazing. I mean, that is our democratic sort of link to Europe, and yet we haven't a clue who it is. 6 people had a clue out of whatever we've got in here. That sort of reveals something. And I mean, the tragedy, in a sense, about the debate is that it's not a debate between making a better Europe and getting out of Europe altogether, but it's a debate between having sort of, slightly sort of grim Europe and getting out of Europe. Well, why aren't we more aspirational? Well, why are people not campaigning, actually say not only vote to stay in, but vote, let's make it work, let's get into the heart of it instead of sitting in the sidelines carping away. We're not satisfied with having a guy like Juncker running Europe. No, we're not. We're not satisfied with the democratic lack of accountability of the people who run Europe. We're not satisfied with the extent to which various elements dominate against others. I mean, there are all sorts of ways, and it could be a very much better thing, but we don't have that discussion because we've got ourselves to a situation in which actually all we're doing is in fact having a vote inflicted upon us by a schism in a political party. That's all it's trying to resolve, and it certainly won't resolve that. By God, do they hate each other? I mean, what's it going to be like afterwards? Who knows? Probably was like that before, but they just didn't talk about it. Now they talk about it. Well, that's interesting. Of course, there are splits in all the parties, it's all true, and we happen to concentrate on the ones that are most obvious. Alienation, I think, in the end, in part, political alienation here, does go back to some of the behaviours of the last several decades, and clearly the war is one of the most alienating factors of all. I mean, in my lifetime, I've never seen 1 million people on the streets until the war. And we saw 1 million people on the streets here in London. And it was defied. and it represented a huge feeling in the country that this was a bad thing to do. It turned out to be a very bad thing to do, as indeed Afghanistan has turned out to be a very bad thing to do. That interventionist wars on these scales like this are not the ways in which to resolve these crises. Crisis in part, and here it is in this title, crisis in part is born of the failure to use institutions to resolve issues. And, you know, the United Nations hardly ever gets mentioned. I mean, who even knows the name of our own ambassador? You know, in the old days, the United Nations was a very formidable body. And it probably was one of the bodies which kept the Cold War system of counterbalance and balances and the rest of it, and complaint and counter-complaint, aired and organized. It was a forum in which you could resolve these things. But I mean, I haven't heard a report from the inner sanctums of the United Nations. Of course, poor old United Nations, the only time they ever get mentioned is when they're actually dealing with a crisis which involves human beings sinking in the Mediterranean. They're not talking about it in New York in terms of trying to find a formula for resolving the Syrian war. I mean, I've not heard the Security Council having endless open-ended debates. I mean, in the old days, you used to say, come on, let's just put them in a room and tell them to get on with it, and they won't be let out until they've done it. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. There's no serious talking going on about that particular crisis. But I'd also like to sort of pick somebody from the developing world. I had the good fortune to go to Brazil to report on the Amazon and climate change and various other things, which was a few years ago when Lula was president. And I mean, maybe not many people knew perhaps much about Lula, but he was a very, very inspirational guy. He was a guy who'd come from working class origins. He was a trade unionist. He'd lost some fingers in an industrial accident. And a very, very, very charismatic guy, and a sort of bloke you yearned to interview. And I had the amazing experience of going to Manaus, where there's an amazing opera house, but I won't go into that. But I went to Manaus in the Amazon and met him and did an interview with him, and I was absolutely blown away. I thought, what an absolutely amazing guy ever to have got to the top of a huge country like Brazil. And of course, Brazil was then booming, etc., etc. I mean, the horror of discovering that he and everybody else had their fingers in the till. However many fingers he had left. I mean, I can't bear it. I mean, and in a sense, there was a bit of that with Blair. I mean, anybody as old as me can remember being in 1997 on the banks of the River Thames, waiting at 5 a.m. in the morning for Blair to come back from his constituency up there in Northumberland. And in all honesty, it felt like waiting for the risen Christ. Somebody young, presentable, articulate, the rest of it, had got into Downing Street with the promises of change that we'd never had made before, not in my lifetime, the rest. And of course, it all came to naught. Things were achieved, there were good things done, but fundamentally it was completely blown away by this absurd and utterly irresponsible and criminal decision to go to war with the Americans out there in a country of which we knew little and cared less. Iraq was a country I had been to many, many times as a journalist. I was there for the Iran-Iraq war. I was in Iran for the revolution. It was a whole area about which I care and still care hugely. After all, you know, we're talking about a crucible in which civilization was born. I mean, people in Babylon were writing alphabets, adding up maths when we were still on our bellies in caves. I mean, and it had come to a situation in which you say, these people are so animal, they really need bombing. And what are we left with? We're left with this utterly ghastly situation. Iraq was a country in which Sunni and Shia lived together, coexisted. There were intermarriages on a huge scale. There were intercommunal relationships. There were Sunni shrines in Shia areas, Shia shrines in Sunni areas. And it worked. It was beneath the tyranny, no question. Saddam was a brute and a horrible man and all the rest of it. But he was secular, and at least he didn't have an axe to grind on one side or the other. And a life existed beneath. Not in any way a heavenly life, but a life, a spiritual and a social life, which sustained despite everything above. And when they dropped that bomb, they blew it to pieces. There are now no intercommunal relationships in Iraq. In effect, it's been utterly detonated, and the divisions are absolute, and the tensions are enormous, and of course, we are where we are. And it's this kind of behaviour that has alienated people so deeply from the political classes. Now, throw into that equation our capacity to talk to each other online and to yell online. And I think one of the worrying aspects of the digital age is that actually we think we've done something when we abuse somebody online, or when we sort of write a rather clever blog which tears somebody to pieces, or even deliver a lecture that is full of absurd sort of stuff like stuff I've been throwing out. We think we've done a great thing, and that's it. Well, I've aired that, and I feel much better for that. I've said it online. I've written a blog. I've retweeted this excellent article from this madman in Arkansas, or whatever it is. I've done my bit today. I feel that's great, and people are following me because I've said things they agree with. This is rather. I feel better today. I've tweeted, I've Facebook, boundless people have come in and said, "Hey, I agree with that. Yeah. Oh, yeah, like." It's enormous fun. And you do feel good. You feel you're connected to humanity and the rest of it, but you haven't seen anyone's face. You haven't kissed their cheek. You have not really done anything but satisfy yourself that you've aired your particular gripe for that day. And whilst I think that can be useful, probably quite useful for the individual and probably even potentially useful for the collective, it doesn't go anywhere. I mean, you see, part of the thing is that you have been bereft of what we had. We were paid to go to university. We were actually funded to go to university. I grew up in an age when debt was an absolutely scandalous thing. The idea that my parents could ever have had a debt of £40,000, £40,000 would have been absolutely unspeakable. You just couldn't have got away with it. And they tortured you at their knee. They said, you can't spend more than you've got. I'm giving you 10p for your, or 10 pennies even, for your pocket money, and you mustn't go over that. In fact, you couldn't, because nobody would give you any credit. And now we're in this age in which students, the engine, the mechanic of revolution, the rebellion, everything else is squashed. Who is going to risk this vast debt by turning out on the streets to protest or do any of that? I mean, of course, people do, but it doesn't go very far. And you do also feel better. I always felt better after I've been on the streets. But I mean, you have to watch what you're doing, because you cannot take risks against this terrible burden that students have been burdened with. I just can't believe it, that we've got people of this age growing up with what we would try to save to buy a house when we were 30. And you can't save when you've got to get this stuff paid off, because as soon as you've got any money, they want it. They want you to pay off your loan, and you want to pay off your loan. And so the whole drudge of debt, it's an unbelievable thing to think that people have been constantly re-elected against this development. And of course, a lot of people are not voting either, and that's another thing. How many people in this room are not registered to vote? Perhaps nobody wants to admit it. Only one. I can't believe it. Perhaps because we're in a political science centre, everybody is registered. It's not a very coherent offering, this, but I'm trying to I'm trying to use you to help me to get through what I seem to be involved in, which is part of this digital rebellion. Which speaks for the alienation we feel about the mismanagement of the world in which we live. And I can't really see the way through to how you change that. I mean, the digital age is sublime. I mean, it's the greatest age ever to have lived in, and yet also the worst of ages to have lived in. Now, that is an amazingly schizophrenic condition to be in. There is nobody in this room who doesn't love the digital age. And there is nobody, but you're an old codger.
It's not because I don't understand technology. It's because I understand how to use the technology to do journalism.
Yes, well, I mean, that's true. But, well, journalism, yes. And where does journalism come into all this? I mean, of course, journalists are using the social network extensively, and I'm using it extensively. But, you know, Channel 4 News, for which I work, is really now a digital content provider. Far, far more people consume what we do through Facebook and Twitter than they do through a television. Actually, our viewing figures have not particularly gone down, unlike most others, have even gone up 1 or 2%. I mean, we're very proud of 1 or 2%. But our digital profile has rocketed, and that may be because of a television achieved a brand which is attractive in the digital sphere. But this challenge, and this is the challenge, how do you harness what we're able to do in the digital age and turn it into something which changes the political and physical reality around us? That is the big thing, because it's all very well to say Westminster is unfit for purpose. Westminster is unfit for purpose. That's not even a controversial thing to say. You're just stating a fact. It is unfit for purpose. I mean, I haven't mentioned the House of Lords. Most people don't mention the House of Lords because they didn't elect it, so they don't have a sort of relationship with it. It is an amazing thing. Nearly 900 people for whom we're paying. I mean, if they turn up. You know, and all the panjandery and all the rest of it, I mean, is something. It's not even controversial. It's not controversial. It's not controversial that we have a large, unelected, ennobled, name-changing situation. It's very, very interesting. And that is because we've been subdued, I think, by the digital age. We have actually become inured because we're living another world. We're living a life where we communicate in a different way from the way they are communicating. And I don't know how long this particular standoff is going to prevail. And on that note, I think we ought perhaps to widen out the discussion. Thank you very much.
I'll take questions in a second. I just want to follow up, John, because in a way you've demonstrated there
the evasion of journalists.
Yeah, well, the schizophrenia, certainly, in that you managed to demonstrate, on the one hand, as a journalist, you are that guy on Twitter who captures the meme, who expresses the alienation so eloquently and extensively that people feel.
No, if that were true, I'd have been fired.
Yeah. And even sometimes, you know, with your empty chairs and so on Channel 4 News, you're able to, again, give a flavour of that in a broadcast programme. But at the same time, you're also deeply frustrated that that isn't having the impact that you wanted to, that in a sense you're sort of shouting in this room full of people, but the real people that would make a difference are somewhere else. Do you think there is a danger? Are you saying that both mainstream media, with its perhaps cynicism and scepticism, combined with your sort of digital therapy, I think you're almost characterising it as a kind of therapy rather than activity, how do we break out of that?
Well, I mean, people know the facts of what's going on in the Mediterranean. And people know the facts that there are 1 million people on the move in Europe. I mean, we feel powerless, and in a sense we are powerless, but we supposedly have the mechanisms to empower the people we elect to do something about it. And I mean, clearly, taking 20,000 refugees over 5 years is probably not really a realistic response. I mean, I may be wrong, but it seems to me it might not be perhaps a realistic response. And yet, that's it. Bang. That's what we're doing. So let's move on to the next thing.
Well, that's
I mean, isn't that true?
Well, that's a good example, isn't it? The refugee crisis has been extensively covered. Everyone knows about it. But it's actually, in many ways, had the opposite effect. The politicians have acted, haven't they? They've stuck fences up. You know, they've sent people back, as far as they could at least, to places like Greece. So people know about things, and yet perhaps they're not as liberal as you are.
Well, no, I don't think it's a question of liberal or otherwise. I think we're dealing with a vast humanitarian crisis, and we've elected people to deal with vast humanitarian crises. I mean, actually, the unraveling of empire and the sort of general drift into Commonwealth and then drift into sort of, abyss, has all happened. I mean, in the early days, that's what we expected people to deal with, and when there was an insurrection or in Rhodesia, as it was, they kind of dealt with it. I mean, maybe with our agreement or not with our agreement, but at least they did something. Now they're doing nothing, and we don't even bother to write to them. Yeah. I mean, who in this room has written to an MP? Oh, quite a few. Interesting. Oh, good old activists in here. I wrote to Nicky Morgan the other day. I haven't had an answer yet. I've never written to a minister before, but I wrote about the decision to get rid of Farsi from the A-level and O-level syllabus. Brilliant timing. Just at the moment, Britain is about to send the biggest trade delegation it's ever sent to that region. And we've decided that next summer, nobody will be able to take Farsi. Now, I know there may not be many people in this room who want to take Farsi, but it would sure as hell be useful for a few people at least to be learning Farsi, because actually you need to be able to speak Farsi if you're going to work in Iran. Well, there we go. I mean, I don't suppose I will get an answer, but I just wrote saying I do think the timing is perhaps a pity. Why not hold off and see if we need it?
Yeah.
I'll let you know if I get an answer. I'll tweet the answer.
And finally, are you, you've always strained against the bounds of, so-called objectivity, etc., and the kind of Ofcom requirement, even upon Channel 4 News.
I don't actually think I have, to be honest. I've never been ticked off by Ofcom.
No, but that's because you don't say on screen what you say off screen all the time.
Steady, Doctor.
No, it's not. It is true, because I work with this man.
No,
Do you think that...
I do dispute it, actually. I don't think I ever say anything or hold back on anything. I mean, if I know it's true.
Well, do you think more people should do the same, then, in mainstream media? Do you think there has been a lack of it?
I'll tell you what I really feel, and I think the difficulty... And one of the reasons why I don't believe in the study of journalism, is there a dreadful thing to say?
Yeah, it is
a study. I don't believe in a study of journalism. And when anybody ever asks me, shall I do a journalism degree, I always say no. Do a degree that's of some use. Study science, study language, study history, study anything, but don't study journalism. Because basically, in the end, journalism is an experiential thing. You observe and you begin to record and you begin to distill and you begin to write and you begin to frame. Of course, you need 3 weeks of deep indoctrination as to how to work a video camera and sort out digital editing and the rest of it. That's really useful, the technical stuff. I sometimes say to people, you don't do a master's. That's very, very useful in journalism, but don't read a degree because it's not about anything. I mean, you arrive, you're going to be a journalist, and you've read journalism, and that's one of the problems with politics. You've been a SPAD, and then you become an MP, so all you've ever done is politics, and politics isn't anything. Politics, what is it? Politics is the ingredients of politics, is life that goes into politics, is science that goes into politics, all the rest of it. So, where were we? What were we talking about?
You were just killing my
a big point I would want to make is that I came to journalism from the NGO sector, and I think that is an incredibly important thing. I think if in fact you've had to deal face to face with people in serious trouble, it is massively informing, because you set more or less everything you've ever done against that. Every time you come up against something, you say, where does this fit? I mean, I worked in a day centre for homeless and vulnerable teenagers. I actually just gave up last month being chair. I've been chair for 30 years, I think, which is ridiculous. So I've remained involved with it for 40 years. And it has informed my every working day as a journalist. To be able to, I go into the day centre more or less once a week. I meet the workers, I meet some of the kids coming in, the rest of it. And that is an incredible counterbalance to the ridiculous swirl in which we all live, in which we meet other people who are paid the same way we're paid, politicians, business people, sports people, theatrical people, all the rest of it. And underneath there are people who are living a completely different kind of life, and if you don't understand that and you can't offset that against... The other thing I did was VSO. My God, if you've lived in the south looking north, you just cannot see the world in the same way. So if you put those ingredients together, if those are the ways in which to prepare for journalism, is get raw and dirty out in the developing world, get raw and dirty in our own world here in the so-called developed world, and then after that you can put everything into perspective.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Let's take some questions from the floor. If you'd like to put your hands up, we've got a question right there in the middle.
Thank you very much for a very good talk. I'm going to, first of all, I'm Olga. I work for the European Parliament press office in the UK, actually, hence knowing my MEPs. And because in my work, obviously, I interact with journalists day to day, and I think the issue of trust is a very interesting one. Firstly, because I think the public and the institutions probably would answer the question about the lack of trust in journalists very, very differently. That's one thing. And my question to you, I guess, is what would you say is behind diminishing trust in journalism? Is there a diminishing trust in journalism? It's not something that I hear from journalists myself. And if there is a diminishing trust, why is that? Is this the 24-hour news cycle? Are there extra pressures on the job? And is there a difference between broadcasting and written journalism, online journalism, and so on and so on? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, diminishing trust, I think there's a birth of realism rather than the diminishing of trust. The number of journalists who don't trust other journalists is pretty high. You're constantly reading something and think, I know where they're coming from. They've pushed this one and they've managed to contort it into something other than I think that it probably is, whatever it is. So, I think it's good to be mistrusting of journalists. It's good to use the journalist as one route to trying to discover what's going on. But given that we can gather so many other sources now ourselves and set them against what we're reading, in many ways I think we're in a better position to know what's going on than we've ever been. The problem is we're not doing anything about it. That's the problem. The problem is not that we're ill-informed, because I think we're better informed than we ever have been. It's wonderful that the news of the world doesn't dominate our Sunday reading, because it was crap. It did some really good investigations, but it was also full of rubbish, and needless stuff that pulled people to pieces and the rest of it. I actually think that the landscape is good. It'll be sad if whole media organizations die because there's no monetizing of what we do. There is far too much really good work that goes unpaid. Brilliant online material that for which nobody's paid a bean. And I find it extraordinary that actually we haven't developed a very sophisticated and clever way of microfinancing what we take from the web. Because actually if it cost 0.5p of a p, or it was even a p or 2p's, the fact is that would very quickly accumulate considerable sums. It's hard to imagine, but it's true. If you see something which has had 250,000 hits, well, that's 250,000 p's. Or there must be a way of doing it which doesn't actually reduce people's enthusiasm to look for truths. So I'm rather optimistic. I think trust, in many ways, what's happened is reality has taken over. People are prepared now to question in a way perhaps they didn't before. But the problem is we're so busy on our terminals on our iPhones, on our laptops, that we're not bothering to communicate with each other and start the ball rolling. You know, the ball ain't rolling at all.
Right, I'd like to come right down the front, actually. Just can you stick your hands up if you also want to ask a question so I can work out where to go next? All over the place, okay.
Hi. You say you didn't push the boundaries of Ofcom's limits, but the government is now planning privatisation of Channel 4 by all accounts. So aren't you now facing your own crisis, and how do you think that crisis will play out?
Well, I mean, I don't know whether they are planning to privatise Channel 4. We may change our names to Dominatrix Television. I don't know. Sorry, that was an inside the Beltway joke. No, I don't know whether they're going to do it or not. I mean, if we are privatised, the chances of something like Channel 4 News, which is a very, very expensive product, I can tell you, news is a very, very expensive business, really expensive. And I think the chances of its survival, you know, the amazing thing about Channel 4 is that it's owned by everybody in this room and costs them nothing, at all, nothing, because it's funded by advertising very successfully. I mean, there is a genuine anxiety in government that model might not sustain for very long with the withering of television and the growth of unpaid-for online reception. I mean, you know, most of our packages, most of our reports are accessed online, and you know, there's no advertising around them, and everything's, in terms of money generation, is lost. But I genuinely think there is not there's not an overwhelming enthusiasm to privatise it. There may be a need at some point further down the line when the model begins to come under strain because people aren't advertising on television anymore to look at it. But I don't think at this moment it would be a great idea. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Okay, let's take a couple more. There was somebody over that side. Yeah, you. The person next to the guy in the purple top.
Hi, I work as an online journalist for News Corp Australia, and I just wanted to ask about something that seems to me a sort of dangerous byproduct of this digital age, is this sort of gotcha culture that we've created where people are so afraid to say anything nowadays because, you know, whole careers can be taken down by ill-timed tweets or, you know, off-the-cuff comments. How do we
I think you may have just witnessed it in this room.
But how do we sort of move away from that, and how do we get people to, you know, get a bit of thick skin back, and get people to move past the, you know, look at the nuance of a debate rather than just the headline or just the...
I think it's an incredibly important question, and I think basically, in a way, there are two words in play here. One is trust, and the other is judgment. And, you know, just for the sake of sending someone up or in some way embarrassing them or whatever it is by reporting some loose phrase or whatever it is, one has to think twice. Is this a good idea? You know, I enjoyed the joke, whatever, but you know, I think I'll pass on it because it probably wasn't a great idea to say it, whatever it was. I mean, and that's the problem when the instantaneous, you know, you read this because it's only 140 characters, or because it's only 3 lines on Facebook. You read it so fast and you respond so quickly. Actually, you have to. I mean, we are taught to go on, count to 10 now. Do you still want to tweet that? That is our literal procedure. You count to 10 before you tweet, just in case you have gone completely barking mad and you're about to assassinate yourself online. And I think that would be a great idea. Would you know, digital is so instant, and human beings are not actually instant. They consider. You know, the digital age doesn't consider, it just goes. And when it goes, it can be very damaging. And when it goes, you can't get it back. It's happened. And that is not the way we are as humans. You know, even when we have a row with somebody we love, we can take it back in some way, perhaps, hopefully. We can even apologise. But how much you apologise online, the original is still sitting there.
Listen, we're going to have to stop there because
Oh dear.
at 10 o'clock we've got rolling on to our next session, which is a panel on refugees. After the tea break, we will then have other venues, so the schedule gets more complicated. But stay where you are, because we're going to change over in the next couple of minutes and put our panel in place. But before that, please thank Jon Snow for giving us an extraordinary start.